Boom.
This is Jennifer Richmond, and you are watching the Break It Down Show.
Me and Jennifer just became best friends and neighbors. We are talking off mic, and I'm like, let's just go live. So Will Riley will be here in a minute, and Wink will be here in a minute. They're both working on trying to get logged in. You and I were talking about the ability to discuss race and how much we seem to have gone back away from a more tolerant time and into a time with less tolerance. I guess why are we going backwards? Why does it seem like we are going backwards, and are we going backwards?
Well, I would say we for sure are going backwards. And Will's got some really good numbers. He was talking about them the other day about how when you had a poll back in like the early 2000s versus a poll in 2018, and he'll be able to give you better numbers. But it was something like, let's say 1990, 1995, poll was like asked about racism. I believe it
Mhm.
was like about 70% black and 70% white said, approximately said it's not really a problem. You go fast forward to 2018, so we're talking almost 30 years past,
Yeah,
and the numbers are, I think, I want to say they dropped to like 30s. Again, Will can correct me when he gets on here. So there's something that's absolutely happening. I will say, I think in many ways, on the positive side, I think that a lot of discussions have been forced that I feel like we needed to have certain discussions, but we've kind of gone off the rails in our discussions. And several people
mm,
have made mention of that. I think it's Douglas Murray in The Madness of Crowds. Like he's talking about we're heading in the right direction. It's like a train going up to a station, heading up there, just about there. And then instead of stopping, the train just goes boom, and I feel like that's probably where we're at now. I mean, I think there's many factors to
yeah,
why that is. But what's happening, what bothers me, what worries me is what's happening is we're revisiting segregation. And you can't learn to get along with someone if you're not even in the same room. And that's, I think, where
yeah.
we've gotten that's been one of the biggest problems. We see ourselves segregating in classrooms, in affinity groups, in corporations. And so we're not having the same conversations. And we Wink, when he comes on, he loves Star Trek. We write about it in our book. And there's something that Captain Kirk said something about you can't hate someone when you get to know them, or it's hard to hate someone when you get to know them. And we're just not even taking the time to get to know people.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, that must be Dr. Wilfred Reilly from Kansas or Kentucky State University. How are you, sir?
Hey, Will.
He can. All right, Will's getting geared up still. Yeah. The other thing too we were talking about is the moment you try to have a conversation that involves race or racism, emotion inflates the entire room. All of the other variables that impact social interaction are blasted out of the way, and people just start on offense and arguments instantly. Like there's not even the capacity to have a nuanced, intelligent conversation where both sides can learn.
I think that that's the biggest tragedy of our current time is the level of offense. I mean, offense is, constant in all of our lives, but it's just we have become so hypersensitive that everything is offensive. We go on to things like microaggressions, right? And questions of how can I ask where, I mean, some people love to be asked where they're from, but that's become so everyone's so scared of offending that we just stop the conversation altogether. And that is what is I have not seen since this journey. And I'll tell you a little bit about the journey as Wink is getting his camera set up, because it started really, or our conversation started in some respects with me. I'm a China scholar. I used to work in, I told you offline, in intelligence, running our China desk. And that's all I knew. I lived overseas for a good part of my life. And I had this affinity, if you will, using the slogan word, for this idea of the American dream, even as where it falls apart. And I came back to the United States and I started to notice how truly everything that, looking from the outside in, a lot of people are envious of America, envious of our democracy. I mean, obviously, we've got people coming across the border to be here, right? And So I was so disappointed to find the polarization. And so my research really started around the polarization in America. And as I started to do that, I realized a lot of that polarization was around race itself. And so I didn't feel confident writing about racial issues. So I took the opportunity to go to a diversity training in Austin, Texas. So the city of Austin actually puts on, you can pay, and it's a 2-day diversity training. So I did that, and I've said this, numerous times. I went in with a whole heart. I went in just thinking I was going to learn about things I didn't know about. I went there to learn and to hear other voices, but that wasn't the case at all. It's everything that you've heard bad about DEI happened in that room, and I was so disappointed. I mean, I was put into, Pete, an affinity group with all white people, and I'm like, what am I learning from all, like, we are? And it was because we had the same privilege score, but I was there again with my whole heart to learn, like, what I didn't know. What am I going to learn from people who have the same privilege scores?
Yeah.
So I wrote about it in Aerial magazine, and Wink, my co-author, he ended up, I got a letter from a stranger responding to me, to which I responded. And about 3 months later, after months and days where we would just write long form letters to each other, we said, this is a novel conversation. We're always talking about courageous conversations, right? But that's a slogan word. Courageous conversations is a slogan word. That is, for in the DEI world, courageous conversations means sit down and listen. And so,
yeah.
So I said to Wink, I said, we're actually having a novel conversation here. I think maybe this is something that would be helpful for people who are struggling with the correspondence. And there you go. And that's where we're at now. So I feel like it's the first time that we know of. Hi, Wink. There's my co-author, that we know of, that a correspondence between.
How are you doing?
Good. Between two
we
people.
Always have drama.
We always have drama, of course. But you're here. I'm giving them a little background, so about how we met and where we're at now with the book being published, and that we it's the first time that we know of that there has been a correspondence between both a man and a woman, different, skin melanation, and also different age groups. So we feel like it's a pretty novel look. And we can tell his story, but a lot of it turned out to be Wink schooling me, if you will, on how the conversation that we're currently having, or the mainstream conversation on race, actually does nothing to expose, if you will, the resilience and the triumph of Black America. Indeed, it does the opposite.
Well, Pete,
welcome to the show, Wink.
Begin by my apologies. Hi, I wanted to express my apologies for my late entry, camera drama. But the point Jim makes about this being a novel endeavor, it really goes to the question of, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be Black in America? And I think, unfortunately, Jen, in her experience with the diversity training, fell into a slew of caricatures and stereotypes. When in fact, if you're wise about race in America, there are over 40 million Black Americans. That means there are over 40 million different life stories, experiences, and perspectives. One of the things about Thomas Sowell's Ethnic America, book he published, was he went into the idea of ethnicities and how they bring different approaches to life. And the same is true for Americans. So when someone raises the question, what does it mean Black? Answer this. It means 40 million different things. Take your pick.
And welcome, Will. He's just popped in down studio here.
Yep. Glad
welcome
to be here.
The show.
Well, I beat you. I beat you to the punch.
Yeah, you did. I was here for a minute earlier, but the sound of my computer wasn't working, so I had to tinker with it a little bit and then pop back. But yeah, glad to be here for our second conversation in a couple days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you miss us, Will?
Yeah, it was a long time apart, but I think I dealt with it pretty well, to be honest. Yeah.
Will, you will notice my jacket and shirt, repeating your performance with Pete 3 weeks ago. You wore a jacket and shirt. So I want to live
Fair
up to
enough.
the world standard.
I didn't know we were dressing up. I would have worn my jacket. Wink, I want to ask you a question. When you talk about the 40 million
Yes.
conversations, we're still trying to sort out the argument between Washington and Du Bois and the black point of view and everything, right? Like, and that's been 100 years, and we still can't decide. And that was Sly Stone and Ali look at the problem of being black in America differently, right? And so you have this continued conversation where, depending on who you're talking to, you're going to have a different point of view, and that's totally cool, right? But we have to allow that to exist in the mirror, and also we have to let folks get to where they're going to get to at the pace that they can get there. Starting with "you're a horrible, evil, fascist, racist, Nazi motherfucker" is not a way to encourage me to grow and learn, and vice versa. Like I can't do the same thing to you or to anybody else I encounter.
You know what I do, Pete, in my daily life? In my daily life, I live in San Diego, which is only 5% black. So most of the people I encounter are not black. And what I always do whenever I encounter anyone is I ask myself and I think about, well, what is that person like as an individual? Who is that individual person approaching me or interacting with me or talking to me or what have you? I don't think, oh, this is a Hispanic person, so I must put them into a box to understand them. I don't think this is an Asian person, so I must put them into an Asian box to understand them. I think one of the blessings, Pete, of my childhood was that I grew up in the 1970s in a southern suburb. And it was a 95% school, grade school, and I was usually the only black kid in my class. So I was forced, right, to develop the habit and custom of understanding the person before me, the individual. I mean, it wouldn't do just to look at race. If everyone's white, that doesn't tell you very much. Same thing applies for blackness. Doesn't tell you very much at all. One of the reasons I love and romanticize Paris, France, for example, is that in Paris, I felt for the first time, you could see a black person walking around the Eiffel Tower or the Arc de Triomphe or the Louvre, and you wouldn't know whether or not they were from West Africa, were they from the Caribbean, were they old generation blacks who lived in France, were they American expatriates, black American? You just wouldn't know, and I love that. We really need to discover or rediscover that richness in the abundance of blackness. Blackness can mean anything and everything because we're individuals at our root. That's our sovereignty, I think.
Will, we were talking. Oh, go ahead. Will, we were talking.
Go ahead.
I was jumping in on you. I'm sorry. Do you want to finish your thought?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I spent 4 years writing the book with Jen, so a lot of my thoughts are out there already.
I'm going to put a link to that book up here in a second.
Thank you.
Will, we were talking before you were able to get all the way in about are we going backwards when it comes to race relations? And Jennifer was referencing some numbers that you had that compared like from the 90s to now. And what are your thoughts on, are we going backwards, forwards? Are we just not sure neither? I don't know. Help us understand.
Yeah, so struggling with the StreamYard camera there a little bit since it's backward in terms of how it views into my office. But yeah, I do think we're going backward when it comes to race relations. And I guess the question here is kind of what's the goal of what you'd call good race relations? And I think that the answer has to be kind of getting beyond race so that you see each person as an individual. That sounds like kind of one of those hokey Obama era cliches, but it's also just, it's true. The goal of the negative potential ending of a diverse society is tribal fighting. And the positive ending, honestly, is people marrying one another and working together in units like the army and so on. It's honestly what you've seen within the white and black communities, where if in the USA you meet someone who is of Jamaican extraction, they're black. If you meet someone who's Irish, they're white. Now, those two groups would violently resist what I just said, but it's how they would be treated by the majority of the population. So that's where you want to get with almost everyone. And I think with a lot of people, including me and Wink for that matter, like if you see a lot of Americans, you're not necessarily sure what their ethnic background is. Like, is that guy, Samoan, Goan, Hispanic? Well, I mean, it's, and there's a positive there, but So anyway, I think that basic idea of everyone be kind of colorblind, you have Michael Jackson, whatever his later flaws, and like Eddie Vedder singing together, arms around each other. That is definitely something that we've moved away from since pretty much any year you could pick in the civilized era, since we stopped fighting each other, 1989, 99, 2008. There's far more obsessive focus on race in kind of the Patrice Cullors, Sean King, BLM, and I mean, some of the guys on the right as well, Nick Fuentes. I mean, there's far more focus on race in this modern year than there was at any point when I was a kid in high school. I mean, like, I remember a lot of those 90s lectures, like, my mom told me not to say racial insults of any kind, including those for whites, because we were all just supposed to be getting along. And now, I mean, it's very, very common, kind of last thing, but it's very common. If you search an article like the problem with white men, or for that matter, the problem with black men, you'd find dozens. You'd find people that took the time to sit down and write this out to critique their countrymen. And I mean, yes, that's not really something you would have seen in the Atlantic in 2002. So yeah, I think you can empirically look at that.
Any expansion on that from either of you?
Well, I've got a question for actually both. Well, everyone, but in particular, Wink and Will.
Right.
Is there any? So we're in agreement here, that, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. Is there any kernel of truth at all in some of the discussions that we've had in the last 5 years on race? I mean, I don't feel like you. I feel like we are backsliding. But has it, on the upside, is it possible that is at least forced a discussion that needed to be had, or no?
Well, I'm going to be very cynical about it, if I can jump in. I mean, I think that it has forced a conversation, but it's forced a conversation among nonconformists. I mean, I see in many ways the past 5 years as an age of increased mass conformity in terms of how we think about race. So in a sense, one unanticipated consequence has been bringing together nonconformists on race who remember the old days, who remember the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s. I mean, I was talking with my daughter maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, and she said to me, she was born in 2002. She said to me, Dad, you tell me about your experiences, but that's like ancient history to me. Anything before 2000 is ancient history to me. I feel for the little kids who are going to school now, grade school, because they will only have known this idea that blackness is all encompassing everything, that blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. We need to reach a new age where we return to the value of the individual first before the racial collective. That's just my thought.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the question, I agree with Wink there, but in terms of the question, like, it was a conversation forced that was needed? No. To some extent, you could argue that we do need the phrase you always hear, an honest conversation on race, which could talk about everything from white generational wealth to really high crime rates in a lot of black communities. We could sit down, try to suicide in the white community. We could sit illegal immigration. I mean, we could sit down and talk with one another about, like, what are the issues your group is having? What can we as a country do about this? Opiates are a big problem in a poor white areas. That's essentially where I live now in Kentucky, although I live in the urban region of the state. But I mean, that's not the conversation we had, where there was sympathy for whites as well, and where things were discussed honestly. No, I mean, the conversation we had became kind of, at least in the American upper middle class, sort of a form of rote virtue signaling, where there were these things you were supposed to say, like, well, we understand that racism is systemic. And as someone who was a college executive at the time, so I was very familiar with the admissions process, a step below the Ivies at large schools. I mean, KSU, UK, the question comes to mind, what do you mean by that? I mean, we have pro-minority affirmative action in almost every sector of college and business. And I'm not even really speaking out against that at this moment. But if you're looking for any kind of decent job, you're not going to be systemically held back by these invisible chains. That's just nonsense. But that became a very kind of rote cliche thing to say. sort of semi-skilled social scientists started trotting out any gap between blacks and whites in terms of kind of incarceration rates, and never adjusting for the fact that the black guy is 30 years younger than the white guy, and then kind of chalking this up to racism. So that's really what we had. And a big driving force in that was the whole BLM 1619 narrative, which I really detest as both a black guy and an academic. I mean, the whole, they're murdering us in the streets, thousands a year. The average black or white urban liberal thinks that more than 1,000 unarmed brothers are killed every year by the police. The actual average, the last couple of years I looked at, is 8. So, I mean, I don't really view this conversation as having been helpful at all. And I mean, it's hard to draw a causal link, but you can't not notice that, during the 10 or so years of BLM, starting with Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman's tragic fight, and then going up to George Floyd, the black homicide rates doubled. And because this was specifically seen as a black issue, like the Hispanic and poor white communities that used to have almost equivalent murder rates just don't. They kept their cops. The whole thing was that it's only blacks that are being killed, right? In reality, that was never true, but it provided an easy excuse if you're the police chief in Charleston, West Virginia, or Tucson, Arizona, or something. So, I mean, in fact, there's been a devastating blow to the black community. SAT scores are down. We're starting to catch up with whites a little bit. Crime is through the roof. So I don't think we had a productive conversation now.
We
So
can have I was going to say, to have a productive conversation, as Jen experienced in her training, we've got to flip the script. We've got to flip that script. And, Will touched upon it, white generational wealth, black poverty. Suppose the opposite is also true. Suppose the opposite is also part of reality. Just for kicks, just for fun, I wrote a play to flip that script, to prompt a conversation. The storyline is, for the play, there's a town in Virginia, and it enacts a reparations ordinance for American slavery. But they don't say race, because that would violate the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So there's this family called the Bond family. They're a white family, and they live in a trailer park on Jefferson Davis Highway in this town of Virginia. And the mother is addicted to fentanyl. Her great-great-grandmother was a slave. She was emancipated by her owner. And so she wants to apply for the reparations because she can fund her drug habit. I need that $5 million in my pocket. And she goes onto 23andMe, and lo and behold, what does she discover? She discovers her black fourth cousins, also named Bond, but happen to be upper class, second generation Ivy League, and they have a summer house in Martha's Vineyard. So the whole play is about, within this white poor family, is it ethical and moral to claim $5 million in reparations just because we're the wrong race, even though we're the descendants of an American slave? And I think that wonderful example flips the script nicely and forces us to go beyond caricatures and stereotypes.
I would say, with regards to the word flipping the script, I think actually that's what current activists have done. They took the script, from back in the earlier time where we were dealing with a very severe problem of racism, and we were ostracizing groups of people based on the color of their skin and grouping them into just what their skin color said about them. We're flipping the script and doing the exact same, but in the opposite direction. So I would say, instead of flipping the script, we need to change the script altogether. It's the same play. We just switched out who's wearing what colors, and the game remains the same.
But the problem, Jen, is, and you know it, if you tell someone, well, there have been free blacks in the past before the Civil War. There are blacks who have second homes in Martha's Vineyard. There are blacks who are third generation Ivy League. They'll say, well, that's whataboutism, or you are just enabling white supremacy, or you're not allowed to say that in the public square. That's taboo, to steal a line from Will. That's taboo. You can't say those things. And I just think that's part of the problem. In our book, Pete, Jen and I broke through those taboos at warp speed. We really, really wrote with abandon. Would you agree with that, Jen? Did you have ever since we were captured in taboo, we wrote our dialogue, our book?
Oh my, yeah. We were taboo. That's why we asked Will to get involved.
Right.
A fellow dissident.
So, plugging Will's book.
Yes.
I can't hear you. Well,
Mute.
Yeah, I said you guys should, the audience should focus on buying the guest's book right now. But yeah, my book is not,
That's right.
not subtle. I do most of my Fox and CNN, if they want to call and so on, hits from this room. So yeah, it's there. And actually, I was going to say, I bet you anything the other book is behind this one. So anyway,
it's right there. Put the link right there.
Yeah, get the book, and so you get all of our books. Pete's done some writing as well. But okay, but I mean, in all seriousness, though, I think that Jen's point is extremely valid. So this might sound totally unrelated at first, but I recently had a conversation with a communist, and he was talking about, well, a somewhat rehabilitated communist, but he was talking about his realization about communism, which is that to some extent, most leaders in communist societies don't think you're actually going to get to the perfect world. So communism is this, it's designed as a two-step model. And the problem is that step two never works. So the first step is that kind of the leaders of what's sometimes called the second guard, like student leaders, generals, union leaders, take over from the first guard, which is business people and that sort of thing. And the second step is supposed to be that the leaders of the second guard then, give all their shit to the people. So they've defeated their ancient enemies. They take everything, they divvy it up, they calculate its value, and then they give it to illiterate mill workers. And the problem with communism is that step two has never, ever happened. You can go through as a political scientist 80 countries where it did not happen.
Yeah.
But this guy was talking to me and he said, well, my father was a left-wing activist in my country, which happened to be Venezuela. And we were very aware that it would just be the lower elite taking over from the upper elite. But that benefited us because we were in the lower elite. And that's why we favored communism. And that's why all student leaders and union leaders and soldiers and that NCO through Captain Band and so on very often have sympathy for this. And it was a brutally honest explanation. And my reaction was, okay, I hadn't thought of that. And it's kind of, but it's just, I think it's the same thing with race relations. I think there are only two positions you can have on race relations. One is that everyone's equal and you should try to treat people as individuals. The other is I'm approaching this as a competitor, and I think some groups should be treated better than others. And members of the Black and Asian and Jewish American elite really dislike it when you phrase it that way. But that's what this amounts to some extent. Hispanics as well, Cuban Americans now entering that group. If you're advantaging members of minority groups when it comes to application to Yale, that means you're disadvantaging their white rivals who are generally doing slightly better on the test. That's all that can mean. So why do members of minority groups that are themselves doing pretty well favor all of these programs? Well, because there's a huge element of personal advantage. So I like that comment about we're not just flipping the script, we're using the same script with the positions reversed. And you see this now, like I'm at an HBCU, we don't have this problem. But in a lot of solid colleges where there are a lot of Black students, we're actually seeing segregation come back. It's just with a minority face. So it's not that there's not a Black student housing unit called the Levy that kind of stops where all the Black kids have to live. There's a Black cultural center that's the nicest building on campus where all the Black kids get to live. There's no difference in practice except the question of who kind of has, forgive me, the whip hand. So I would agree with that. I think that the goal is to not do that. You can't have a law that says we're going to treat Hispanics better than whites. You also can't have a law that says we're going to treat whites better than Hispanics unless you want a lot of ethnic tension. And the examples are everywhere: South Africa, Libya, so on down the line.
Will, how do you perceive the recent brouhaha about reparations in California and the idea by San Francisco that $5 million is an appropriate remedy for that, and that 8 out of 9 members on the commission were Black, just happened to be Black?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple of examples. This, first of all, obviously is a case of what we're talking about, that Black people in a power position are saying, you know what, we still on average, if you look at upper middle class Blacks, have several $100,000 less in household wealth than upper middle class whites. Both groups are doing quite well. But if we're in a power position, what would we do? Well, we might give ourselves some money. Yeah, I think that comes into play. The other thing with the San Francisco plan, I will say, is just I'm kind of annoyed by it as a Black guy because it makes Black people look stupid. I mean, so in California, the black-white gap in household wealth, which has to be like, you have to be claiming there's a harm coming from that legal background to demand, compensatory or punitive damages. The black-white wealth gap in that state is like $100,000. And that's per household. That's everybody in the household, along with the head of household. So to say, well, we want $5 million a piece and $15 million per household or whatever.
That's right.
Yeah. The question is just why? And like methodologists have asked them this, and they've just kind of
because they want to be rich.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like, yeah. No, California also, by the way, California was never a slave state. Entered the Union as a free state. Didn't come into the Union until like 10 years before the Civil War, by the way, the 49ers and all this. Quite a few of whom were black. And it's always been it's sort of a destination for hustling black cowboy types, airplane mechanics, boat builders. Yeah. There's never been an incredibly deprived black community, at least prior to the Watts riots and all that. There's just no argument at all. Like Hispanics would have a much better argument. Like we actually were peons under the Spanish and then under everybody else. And we're the illegal immigrant population now in large part.
Yeah.
But actually, kind of one more point, Hispanics might be able to claim this because the California reparations bill isn't based on slavery because there never was any. I just thought about this legally. It's based on the idea that black people have suffered racism. But I mean, so if any money is paid out, I think you'll immediately see claims from Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Native
Americans.
Yeah. Nobody historically was abused in this continent like the Native Americans. Black people, Irishmen, women. I mean, there are claims, but like when you say Native American, they used to own all of this land that we all took.
All of it.
Yeah, like everything. Like reparations would be half of the continent. You have to adjust for the value of what was built on the land and so on. But like reparations for natives wouldn't be on the order of $100,000. It would be everything. That's
trillions.
That's something that we don't even want to open that box. But the natives seem to be just busy kind of working and trying to develop the land we gave them. There's not really a native reparations movement. The land we gave them, what they fought well enough to stay on by the end of the war. But that's not an issue that we've seen.
Jennifer, what do you make of all this stuff? Like when we look at all of these different things, and when you're talking to Wink in the book and your guys' long letters, what do you make of it? Like, how do you have this conversation with Wink? How hard do you push in terms of what your ideas are to find out like what left and right are around you?
Well, it's funny because the book starts out. Now, granted, I'd written this piece about the diversity training and my disappointment in it. So, I started out disappointed. But when Wink wrote me, I was scared, even though I spoke up in this class and I spoke training, I spoke up in a written piece, I was scared what to say. And there was one point, one of our first letters that's in the book, as I said something about like, I know I'm privileged and, da, 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 da. And he was just like, Wink, I'll let you respond. He was, but I'll just end here and let Wink tell you what he said. But he was like, I don't know that we can have this conversation anymore.
Well, we couldn't. I don't use slogan words, Pete. I really don't, as a matter of personal principle. So if I hear a slogan word like marginalization or intersectionality or systemic this or structural that, I know it's not a real conversation. I know it's a conversation that's going to be detached from reality. And it's not worth my time. It's just not worth my time. So I knew that if she were prone to speak to me through the filter of slogan words, sayonara, I can watch Star Trek on the weekends and do other things. So I had to disabuse her of the idea that she had to think of herself and present herself to me on a plate as privileged, quote unquote, because that didn't work for me, number one. And number two, it's kind of offensive. I consider myself kind of privileged. Pete, I grew up in a southern suburb in the 1970s, right? I went to UVA's Nichols Scholar, Harvard Law School. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I have known Michelle Robinson before she became a big name. I worked for congressmen. So why would someone use the word privilege that they have and I don't to set me apart based upon my race alone? Yeah, Pete, that didn't work. And so I'm glad that I helped Jen grow through that artificial filter, because we can't have real conversations, I believe, if we use slogan words. You gotta talk plainly. You have to write plainly. You have to strive for authenticity. You have to recount the things you have experienced and observed and not fear the bullies in the marketplace. You can't fear people who are going to disagree. When I was growing up, Pete, you could disagree without being disagreeable. I haven't changed, Pete. I'm the same person I was in 1972. So
But
the world may have changed, but I still hold to my philosophy of life, Pete. Call me a dinosaur, Pete. You can do it.
All right. Let's
but
get Triceratops to shut up for a second. Bring Jennifer in.
I want to push, but this is what was so important, and this is why I feel like this book is important, is because there was even though he pushed back on me, and so that was uncomfortable because no one really wants to be corrected, you know, but there was a relief because I did feel that I was playing a game. It was, you know, there was virtue, and because of trainings like this, you are told. I mean, literally, we sat there and we had to write down white traits. And the diversity trainer said, these aren't bad or good, they're just white traits. Well, let me tell you what these traits were. Rape culture. I mean, I'm pretty sure you don't need a color to engage in these criminal activities. Violence. And then here's the one that got me. Civility. I was like, so there was civility, and civility was used pejoratively. It wasn't used as a nice thing. I mean, it was looked down upon. And so when you're put in that situation, and I've grown up, as I mentioned before, all over the world in very diverse communities my entire life. And so I was used to this authenticity until I wasn't, until I'm sitting there and this is mainstream. That's the problem. These conversations, the way they're doing these trainings in schools, K through 12, Will can talk about at university level, in corporations, the way they're doing it and putting people in affinity groups. The safest thing, if you are white, is to stay quiet. That's the safest thing. And so when Wink allowed me to actually go, oh, okay, now we can get real. Like, that is when the real writing began.
I think that's true. I would agree with that. And it saddens me in a way that Jen had been conditioned in that way to think about race. But luckily, she grew out of that over the 4 years of our correspondence. And it's funny, Pete, because I've never had those difficulties myself, except sometimes in my family, because my family certainly subscribes to dogma about race. So I sometimes have to repress myself. I once asked Will, actually, this is in the book, another plug to Will. In the book, at one point, I say, how does one deal with conflicting worldviews about race in a Black American family? And I had asked that question of Will. He gave me an answer, but didn't really satisfy me. So I'm going to give Will a second bite at the apple. Will, if I'm living in a Black American family, love them all, love them to death, but they're committed to racial conformity. They're committed to dogma. They're committed to Jack and Jill, Alpha Kappa Alpha, Alpha Phi Alpha, the Belay, Howard University. You know the score. How do I navigate that? Will, that's a hard question.
Can you mute?
All right. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So I think there are two answers there. The one, I think that when people say things that are flatly false, unless it's like Thanksgiving dinner or something like that, there is almost an ethical duty to say, I mean, the way I'd put it with my friends is, nah, bro, like that's not true.
Okay.
And that often does come up when, for example, I'm talking about policing with friends of mine that are Black guys or even Appalachian whites or interracial crime. Yeah. So, I mean, again, it's both Black and white urban men that think that 1,000 unarmed guys, just Black guys actually, are killed every year by the police. And I mean, I have taken people to my computer and said, look, Dwayne and Bobby Lee, like, you just look at this. It's 11, enough. That's not true. Right. And that's actually changed how a lot of like slightly younger working class men I know interact with the cops. Like, there's no risk of death. The risk is 11 over 60 million stops per year. It's not 10,000 over whatever you thought it was, 1 million stops. Because in that situation, I'd be tensed and ready to compete as well. So that sort of thing I do correct. Interracial crimes, another thing I mentioned in passing. You've seen a lot of this on Twitter and Facebook recently. like almost racial competition where people are posting these fight videos like, look what that cop did to him. Well, look what these 4 black guys did to this Irish kid. And it's just this depressing stream of people beating each other up and across the color map. Interracial crime is about 3% of crime if you're talking about serious index crime. So again, I've pulled that up and just shown it to people. Like, you can't possibly believe that most crime in West Virginia or the areas near here is committed by black people. So with stuff like that, I think you do need to kind of step forward and correct. With a lot of the other stuff, I mean, that's almost just a personal quirk that comes out of region and class as much as race. I mean, I've dated, my current partner is Pleasant Jane, who you guys think have met, but is a pleasant break from this. Like, she likes thrifting and that sort of thing, and, you know, does whatever. I mean, in addition to enjoying like classy dinners and so on. But I've dated people that will not shop outside of like 4 stores. I mean, it's just, it's a really irritating quirk. This is not uncommon. I mean, and like, I've talked to people from Chicago and New York that said they would not move to Louisville, which is a city of like 2 million people, because they don't have Philadelphia, Bergdorf's or whatever. And these are people that were being entirely serious. So, I mean, that kind of thing can be irritating. It can be funny. I think what I would do as a father of kids is almost make fun of it. Which is what I have actually done with people in that position who happen to have young children. Like, never be cruel, never create like a power struggle in front of them, but just like, you know, or we could do this, you know, like, where would you prefer to go? You know, X place or like Popeye. And I think that definitely makes the point. Like, oh, there's an entire world outside of this. Like, people who have blue collar aristocratic jobs, master electricians or whatever, instead of working in this space, don't not know what restaurants are. There's an entire world that caters to that mixed audience. Like, let's check that out. But just, I mean, the fact that a woman, for example, might want her son to join an upscale fraternity. I mean, I don't even think that's a black thing. It's just, I think it's kind of dumb. No offense, but I mean, it's just there. I wouldn't really fight over that stuff that much. Like, are we going to the Jack and Jill ball this year? I mean, I don't give a damn about animals, but I'm going to the ASPCA ball with Jane and a couple friends in a couple months. I mean, like, you know, I'm not going to go in there and just start talking about how I hate vegans and how stray cats should be shot with air guns and this kind of thing. I'm just going to kind of put up with it and then write my check, you know? So I don't think there's all that much to do about some of that.
Fair enough.
But what about the talk, right? We often hear about the talk. I always thought the talk was like, here's how you deal with police when you get pulled over. You keep your hands visible all the time. You slow everything down. The whole point of this thing is to let that person know that they're going to go home safe that night, right? And then I find out the talk is, if a cop sees you, he's going to murder you. If you're with white friends, he's going to murder you even faster. And I'm just like, what in the heck? How do we get from this point to that point? Like, and how do you undo the talk so that it's actually informative to your kid and says, hey, number one, don't be an asshole. And then cops are less likely to mess with you. 2, when they show up, let them know they're going to be safe and you're not a problem. And then if they do decide to arrest you, we will figure that out. Almost like the mad version of dealing with cops. Like, just call us. There'll be no problems. We'll take care of it. But instead, we have this thing where we're sowing like fear into young minds, and it's hard to unsow that. Like, that crop is in.
That's true. You mentioned the talk. Growing up, I never had the talk. In fact, I never heard of the talk until maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
As I say in the book, I grew up in a southern suburb. My street was all black, and I remember growing up, there were 2 times when I saw a police car, and it was like watching an elephant stroll down the road. It was so unusual, not the ordinary. We were mystified. But that was my experience. The talk. I'll share this story. I never had the talk with my kids because I think that plays into racial fears and racial dehumanization. So that's not me. If that's going to happen, that's going to come from my lovely wife and my lovely mother-in-law, but not from me. But number 2, and this is a true story. So even if you are a parent and you don't believe in the talk or the racial fear, sometimes it just intrudes itself in your life in terms of Black culture and consciousness. Case in point, one of my sons met a girl and was dating her, lovely woman. I liked her. We met her parents at a little ice cream place in La Jolla, nice place by the ocean. And we're just talking, getting to know each other. And not out of the blue, but out of context, the mother, who was Black, said, "Oh, I worried about your son when he was driving home from Tucson because of the police." And I cringed inside because that's not something I ever would have instilled in my children. And then she said, "Yeah, he has to be concerned and worried." And I just thought, I'll say this: I'm glad they broke up, so she's not a potential person, that I have to deal with over time. But that kind of like racial fear can intrude just because a child happens to date someone from another family, different mindset. And that's one of the things I find most distressing. I myself have no need for the talk, never had the talk, never gave the talk, but you have to live in a universe where other families may approach it differently.
Anybody else want to comment on the talk?
Yeah, I mean, my comment on the talk would just be, and I think again, a lot of this is going to come much more from a class and like a residency perspective than a race perspective. I mean, my mom had a talk with me about the police when I lived in East Aurora, working class area just outside of Chicago. They're not abusive, and it's known for tough cops. But it was just like the thing is, all of my Hispanic, Irish, American, whatever friends also got to talk like, boy, don't mess with the police. Like, it wasn't all that complicated. It was just like, if you get arrested, first of all, we're going to let you sit in jail for a day so you don't get arrested again. Then we're going to bail you out. Don't be abusive to the police. I mean, one of my friend's dads actually literally said, tell it to the judge, which is actually really good advice if you're a young man and you're involved in something like a fist fight case, you're driving too fast. With the cops, just, officer, here's my ID, I apologize. And I mean, if you have an argument, you can bring that in court later when you have a lawyer. I mean, when there's no chance of you getting your ass kicked or getting another charge tacked on. So almost all of my friends, kind of stable working class kids, did get the conversation. There were no racial differences. I actually might poll about this on Twitter or Facebook later because it's such a standard young male conversation. I also will note what's up. So I also will note there's another version of the talk which isn't police related. Like, I don't want to implicate anyone else here, but like my mom also gave me advice on what today I would sometimes describe as brothers and rednecks online, like how to avoid dumbass fights, how to stay out of slum neighborhoods. But I mean, she was just like, this is in Chicago and then in Aurora. One of her comments was, there are a lot of dangers out there that aren't the police or the system. I mean, when you guys go to parties, a lot of them seem to involve brawls and shootings. Maybe you should just take a nice girl on a date. And I mean, I remember thinking that's not bad advice, as you get into that car owning period. Like, I don't want to get shot, and at that time in Chicago, there would have been a pretty diverse range of people capable of doing that to you. So the talk isn't just stay away from the cops if you're in a genuinely tough area. It's also, stay away from the vice lords. So there are two components. One, that occurs for all working class kids. There may be a black-white difference. But also, two, there's a more important talk, which is how to avoid crime, drugs, that kind of thing. And I think the focus on the biggest danger facing you as policing is just insane if you're a young urban man. No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's most likely yourself.
It's most likely other young male warriors. Like, as a black man, and I assume, again, I don't want to racialize all this. I assume up until at least the George Floyd jump, if you're a working class white guy or the Spanish guy, Hispanic guy, these risks are probably close to proportionate, 50+%. But if you're a young black man, your biggest risk in life is other young black men. I mean, the people by far most likely to kill you are other guys that you get in altercations with for gangland reasons, even athletic reasons, just stupid fights. So pretending that there aren't 20,000 murders a year, half of them black, and that the real threat is, the lawman and the Ford Taurus, that's nonsensical.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was looking at the gun deaths or gun violence school numbers, and so many times it's someone after school at a basketball game brings a revolver, and this is not like sullen kid, I'm going to take everybody out type stuff. This is someone coming with a gun to a basketball game, and then when something jumps off, they're glad to shoot. And I'm not trying to racialize that either because young dudes are dumb, but
it's probably mostly black guys.
We get that. What's that?
I said that's probably mostly black guys, though.
But It might be. I don't know. That wasn't in the data that I was looking at. But the thing is there's a lot of noise in this stuff we're sold something on school violence that I don't think any of us would call that a school shooting. They would call that some kind of conflict, like a gang shooting or rival shooting or whatever. But that goes into the data that it's like, hey, look at all these school shootings, and
we talk about that in the book, don't we, Jen? About the Ta-Nehisi Coates in his book Between the World and Me talks about, I think, seeing a gun on the playground in junior high school or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it just reminds me, and we'll agree with this, that we always have to be mindful that different people have different experiences, even if you may share the same race. So, once again, in my example, the only two examples I can think of the talk, it didn't concern police. Two examples. Example one, I must have been 5 years old, and I was in a grocery store. I'm 5 years old, and I saw a candy bar, and it looked good to me. And I decided to take the candy bar, unbeknownst to my mother. And so when my mother checked out and went outside, she noticed that I had a candy bar. And she said, "Where did you get that from?" I said, "From the store." She gave me the sternest look and said, "We pay for everything we have. You take that back right now and never do that again." And that cleansed my soul of any criminal activity. That talk from mom at the age of 5 with the candy bar. And then number two, in terms of fights and assaults, I had a great friend in grade school, first, second grade, Kevin Robertson. One day we were walking home and I was jealous because Kevin was becoming friends with another kid. And I confronted Kevin about this. I was 7 years old. And he said, "It's none of your business who I'm friends with." And I wouldn't take that. And so I remember slugging him and fighting him in the blackberry bush outside of my home. And I won that fight. He was all bruised up. He ran home screaming for mom down the road. And then I went across the road to my grandmother's house because she babysat me. And she was waiting for me. Kevin's mother had called my grandmother and told her what happened. So when I came to the door, she opened the door and she said, did you get into a fight with Kevin?" I said, "Yeah, I did." And she looked at me sternly with like the 1,000-yard stare. And she just said, "We don't do that in this family. That's not who we are." And that made quite an impression on me. And so that was the last time I ever got into a fight because of that stern talking to from my grandma. So I guess my point is, in some ways I'm blessed because the talk for me did not involve police. It just involved, youthful appropriation of a candy bar and learning not to steal and learning not to fight. Is that kind
And
of
also 1-0 lifetime.
class? I don't know.
No
Huh?
losses. 1-0 lifetime in fights too. Another good
That's
point
right.
there.
That's right.
Undefeated.
Thank you, Pete.
That's right.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Pete. So I have one cop story I'll share, so just so people don't think I totally grew up in Mayberry, USA, and I'm like Andy Griffith or something. This is my one cop story. I don't share it a lot because I live by the saying, if you look for the negative, you'll find it. But if you look for the positive, it will overwhelm you. That's from a famous podcaster. I was in high school, Pete, 12th grade, and I was leading up a visitation program because I wanted our school to learn about Native Americans. And there were 2 Indian tribes in Virginia. And I had 2 classmates with me. Ironically, one was white from Georgia, one was Asian American from Alabama, and they were both prejudiced, bigoted. They did not hesitate to use the N-word. But anyway, I had these 2 guys in my car because I was student council president going to the Indian reservation with these 2 guys. So on the road, I lose track of time. I'm thinking about the trip. And unbeknownst to me, I start to speed. It's an old country road in New Kent County. And then I see a police car go by and the lights are flashing. And the dumb guy next to me, the Asian American from Alabama, he says, "Wink, you can run him. Go faster. Push the pedal to the metal. You can ditch that guy." And so my little teenage mind said, yeah, it makes sense to me. So I pushed the pedal and, went up like 80 miles an hour or something to outrun the cops, to outrun the cop car. How dumb is that? That's something a teenage person does, right? So it became clear to me I could not outrun the police car. So he was following me. Will's laughing. I turned to the left and parked the car. And my two passengers were like, and I was like jittery. And the cop came up to the car, to the driver's side, and he said, where's your driver's license registration? Well, I was so nervous. That Gary had to go into my glove compartment to retrieve the registration. And I remember the guy, he was a white guy, probably Southern country. He had his hand like by his holster, his gun holster, and we were just headed there. And I didn't make much of it at the time, but in retrospect, that was certainly an example where if I had been cross or confrontational or aggressive, well, who knows what he might have done. But because of how I was raised and how I was brought up in my personality, I wasn't being confrontational. I was like scared out of my gourd. That's my only cop story. Whereas I have an uncle who says to me, every Black man has a police cop story. Well, that's my one story. Take it for what you will.
I just saw what Aaron said about his stepdad, working class, and he was told, yes, sir, no, sir. I mean, my family, my father's family are ranchers in Texas. I mean, you do not just say, if you just say yes, you might have cussed at them. You say, yes, ma'am. You say, no, sir. Even to this day, I don't live on the ranch, but my cousins who are my age still say, yes, ma'am, no, sir, to their parents. And so similarly, that's how and my father then was military. So in terms of any authority, as in police, we were taught, to do this and put your hands on the wheel and do what they said if you were, caught doing something that you shouldn't have been doing. So
the talk.
I was a teenager, Pete. I didn't know any better. I thought I could race that police car.
Yeah. No, come on. That's what we all think, right? We watch it on TV all the time.
Right.
Hey, we're going to run out of time here, so I want to give each of you a chance to provide any kind of final comments because it's already been an hour. So I guess we'll start with you, Will. And what do you want to say about the book, about any part of this conversation?
Well, I think the book's good. People should buy it. If you guys have a copy, you should hold it up. So yeah, I see there's a direct Amazon link that Pete has dropped on the side. Yeah, letters in black and white. I actually think I got a free copy from you guys, but I bought one online to show support. I guess I pre-ordered it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Will.
So I'm not the first, apparently. Dozens have been sold. But yeah, I check out the book. But I think the basic idea of the book, that people need to talk honestly about all these topics, and that the goal is something very close to colorblindness, is just an obvious truth that we need to return to. Not to super wonk out here, but one of the things I've realized doing pretty significant research not like a lot of it over the years, is that there aren't that many deep, surprising truths about people. Like in the social sciences, we're not finding exotic new chemicals. We're looking at the same people that Aristotle wrote about. So what you normally see is patterns where people do something logical, like not provoke racial tensions, and then periods where people stop doing something logical and, for example, start provoking racial tensions. And then you see ordinary people in leadership roles saying, no, that's stupid. We should go back to doing A instead of B. And I think this is a very well-written example of that to some extent. I mean, obviously, you can't be close friends with someone. This also applies for young people with consent, sex, dating, so on down the line, by the way. But if everything is done in this sort of cringy lawyer-like fashion, or if every time when you guys talked about how you initially began talking to each other, and for one, if not both of you, there were all these words that you have to use, like, well, speaking as a light-skinned Black man in a position of financial, and it's like, you can't do that. I think this book illustrates that pretty well. But again, the idea of returning to things that make sense is a good one, and most of those things are quite simple.
Who's next?
I'll go next. I'll let Wink have the last word. since I had the first word. For me, it's two things. It's slowing down and actually taking the time to get to know someone. So I feel like we don't do that much in this era of Twitter and social media. And I feel like that's one of the reasons. That's one of the, I think, fundamental reasons that we are fraying as a society, race relations and other ways, because we're not having that conversation. And so this was a labor of love. And Wink and I don't spend that much time on social media because we spend more time trying to get to know each other or get to know other people. So I hope that it is an example of that and other ways to communicate. But then I hope that it also gives people courage to start that conversation, because that's not what I'm seeing right now in the public square, is that courage to ask genuine questions and to be authentic with each other. And Wink, I leave the last to you.
Jen, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I would only say that our book is an example of the best that can happen when people take each other as individuals. As I say in the book, you know, you can't assume there's one way to be Black or white in America. There are millions of ways. There are hundreds of millions of ways to be Black and white in America, because we all have our unique life stories, experiences, and perspectives. So what Jen and I have done is understood that millions of people can't talk with millions of people. But if one person in good faith reaches out to another person in good faith and puts the slogan words aside into a trash can and just talks honestly about the highs and lows, the ups and downs of family life and childhood and memories and experiences and observations and heartaches and joys and triumphs and all the rest that makes life what it is, a rich and diverse and nuanced and complex phenomena, then I think ultimately we will have done a good service and a good thing, not just for the two of us as authors, but for our respective families, and more importantly, for the greater public square that can see the beauty of good faith conversation.
I love it. All right, stand by. I'm going to wrap this up.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.